If you value these conversations, subscribe and leave a review. It helps more than you think. You can also visit Jeansland.co and sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter. It gives you access to our full archive, along with the developments, shifts, and stories shaping the denim supply chain in real time. Follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram to stay connected between episodes. So Ayesha, thank you very much for coming here today. I'm really grateful that you share time with us, me and our listeners. And I'd like to start, you have this organization called Remake, which I really love. And perhaps you can share with our listeners how you started it and your background and how we got to this.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for having me here. I'm a big fan of your work and all that you do. So happy to be here. I'm Ayesha, the founder and CEO of Remake. I have, for the last 15 years, been working in different ways for the fashion industry to care about garment workers, to care about sustainability, to care about justice. As a Pakistani American, I've seen sort of the impact of manufacturing, both in terms of promise of good jobs and the impact on people and planet firsthand. Prior to founding Remake, I both worked with companies directly as well as with the International Labor Organization. So tried this work in many settings and really founded Remake with this idea of we're needing more radical disruption. We're needing to push more of a regulatory environment, campaigns, different ways for this industry to care about people and planet, because it's changed a lot, as you know, in all the years that we've been doing this work.
The change is incredible. I can't even believe how much it's changed. So on your website is this saying, which I really love, and maybe you can explain it, which is where your values. I mean, it's clear enough what you're saying, but I guess my real question is, how do we make consumers want to or be aware that they can connect a purchase with values? How do we do that as an industry? I mean, I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah, when I founded Remake, it was with this idea of remaking connections with the often hidden underbelly of the fashion supply chain, right? You don't see garment workers. Who is she? I say she because of the 70 million people who make our clothes. It's mostly women, mostly Black and brown women that look like me. And yet, from the glitz and glamour of what you're buying, whether on TikTok or Instagram, you don't see her. And I really believe that to get citizens to care, one, you can't shame people. It's hard to build a movement around rage and shame. And so the idea with Where Your Values was really an invitation. And what I like to say is, look, if you care about and believe that women should be paid fairly, if you care about the climate crisis, if you care about sustainability, if you care about dignity of work, whatever is the inroads with which you can care about this work, then our movement is for you. And so rather than telling citizens what they should care about, fair trade, living wages, all the things we're going to get into, it's more an invitation into what is your value system? And depending on what that value system is, do your clothes represent that? Are you really wearing your values? Because if you say you're a feminist and then you're buying Shein and workers are making 3 cents for the product, then what does that say about you? If you say you care deeply about the climate crisis, but most of what's sitting in your closet is polyester fossil fuel, then are you really shopping your values? That's really the thinking behind that slogan.
And how do you get consumers? I mean, how do you find people to talk to?
Yeah, so within Remake, we have our education work and our advocacy work. We started very much more guerrilla on college campuses, but I'd say there's many different ways that we get citizens to show up in the movement in a real way. Social media has been really important for us. I think it can be a blessing and a curse, but the power of Instagram, TikTok, really to get messaging and especially our campaigns viral has been key. But I really believe in local community organizing. Today we have 2,000 young people. They work in and around the fashion industry. They don't believe this industry represents their values. And they're there on college campuses, in fashion design houses, really advocating and recruiting the organizational machinery that we have. And we operate in many different countries now. And I think that's what it takes, the social media is a tool. I think people sometimes confuse it as activism. The real way to really get citizens to care is to build that local organizing machinery the same way as unions do it. That's what we need. We need sort of union machinery for citizens, and that's what we're out here to do.
Nice. Thank you for the explanation. Next question I have for you is, Remake is based on rebuilding connections between us and the people who make our clothes. The website says the organization unites unlikely allies across the fashion ecosystem, from influencers, creatives, and brand executives to unions, legislators, and garment workers, locking arms to fight for change. Please share an example.
As you know, Andrew, the issues of the fashion industry are wicked problems. And it's not as if one thoughtful brand, one thoughtful labor organization can do it alone. So to give you a very specific example, Los Angeles, right here in my home state of California, is home to where we have most domestic production left in the United States. And until 2022, most workers were making piece rate, reporting making few cents per seam, and taking home very little money. We locked arms with a lot of very unlikely allies. Front out the gate was the Garment Worker Center, who was organizing workers. But then we brought on lots of thoughtful small businesses like Reformation and Christy Dawn, who said, we can't compete with the predatory behavior of brands like Forever 21. And so we endorsed this bill. We also had a lot of young people write to Governor Newsom, take to canvassing, to really ensure that our bill, the Garment Worker Protection Act, was in the media and was getting the social media attention that it needed. And so all said and done, we built this very unlikely coalition of small brand executives, union leaders, thoughtful legislators in the California Senate and House, as well as garment workers. And I'm happy to share in 2022, we passed the Garment Worker Protection Act, which is the first of its kind that has up-chain accountability for brands and retailers, holding them legally liable for wage theft. Now, you've been in this industry a long time. You know how unusual that is. And that really is an example of the ways that we remake connections between these very unlikely bedfellows.
It's a beautiful story because there are so many, I guess it's one of my pet peeves. There are so many seminars, what I call tall foreheads, all talking.
I'm so tired of the talking, you and me both.
They never actually go to the meeting and just lay out the accomplishments for the year. Mm-hmm. And you have accomplishments. So that's entirely different.
Thank you for saying that. I really think that coalition building has to be time bound and laser focused on the task at hand. I think you and I both have very little patience for multi-stakeholder initiatives where we're getting all the right people to the table, but we believe that in itself is a win. And the truth is, we have a climate crisis. We have increasingly a humanitarian crisis around the way that our clothes are made. Less talking, more action. That's what we need.
Well, that brings us perfectly to one of the subjects that I wanted to get into. It's real, like living wages versus minimum wages. So this fascinates me. Bangladesh in particular had this whole recently in the last, 6 months, this whole discussion, let's say, yes, about what the new wages should be. And there was a very strong case that real wages is what they should be getting. They're getting minimum wage. Mm-hmm. And this goes on and on everywhere. And what I don't understand, and maybe you understand this better than me, is why aren't brands judged by whether they have a company policy to have living wages for all their products? I don't understand why they wouldn't.
Well, I think really, Andrew, it's the elephant in the room, right? All roads, I like to think, lead back to living wages and the fact that we are simply not paying people enough to make our clothes today. Thinking about Bangladesh, and we were heavily involved with our Bangladesh garment worker partners. The ask then back in the fall was very simple. Workers were up against skyrocketing inflation, currency devaluation. And, the thing that I think is really important here to understand is that the prices paid by brands and retailers over that time period of not having seen wages go up in 5 years, the prices brands paid had relatively remained flat, even though Bangladesh is such an important production hub, third largest, right, for the United States. And what worker partners were sharing, the Asia Flow Wage Alliance did a study that even if you had two family members, husband and wife, working in the garment sector, workers are reporting not enough to have a sufficient caloric diet, that they were skipping meals to meet expenses. All they were asking for was something like $208 a month. And so I think it's very telling that for 30 years of voluntary corporate responsibility, CSR programs, and codes of conduct, we have not really made a dent when it comes to living wages. Because when it comes to living wages, I think that's really the only way for us to meet all of the brand's own commitments to their codes of conduct, not just in terms of having jobs of dignity, but also for it to be a climate solution. The reason we're making so many things so cheap is by undercutting wages. But, as you've said, the industry has fundamentally changed. And in the era of instant fashion and the Sheins and Timus of the world becoming juggernauts, it's really hard to compete. And so, whether Bangladesh, whether Pakistan, what you're seeing is even minimum wages being kept artificially low in order to compete for this race to the bottom.
But that discussion in Bangladesh, to me, on the outside, seemed like it's with the government and the labor unions, and it seemed to me to be odd because I don't think the garment factories have any problem raising the prices if the brands will accept it.
I
So the
mean,
brands,
you're exactly right. We wrote to all the top producing brands in Bangladesh at the time of the crisis to say, can you support? Can you lend your voice? Can you lend your connections to being a key strategic buyer in this country for what the workers were asking for, which is really just $208 a month.
crazy.
And outside of Patagonia, you couldn't get any brand to do it. And really, Patagonia has such a small footprint in the country. So, all that to say, brands then tend to hide behind this idea of this is between the labor movement and the government and the national sovereignty of Bangladesh, and we don't want to interfere. But again, the prices they pay are directly correlated with why we keep seeing minimum wages not going up. So it's a little bit of a tongue in cheek, really. I don't think any brand should talk about being a sustainable leader unless they're willing to talk about wages.
I think every brand should be judged. You're either paying living wages or you're not.
Yeah, I mean, we published the Fashion Accountability Report where we look at the top 52 brands. And one of the things that is amazing to me of all these years of evaluating, and corporate responsibility reports got thicker and thicker, but the place where you see the least amount of progress is living wages. And most companies outside of pilots and policies have simply made no progress because it's directly tied to money. CSR for the most part is a marketing exercise. When it comes to wages and paying people fairly, that's about the core business model. And that's why I think we haven't made any progress.
I always think it's an insurance policy,
Mm,
just not to be in the news.
mm,
Everybody wants to do the minimum they can to make sure that they're not picked up in any report. Anyway,
okay.
laws. Let's talk about laws.
Yes.
Lots to talk about laws. For most people in the industry who are probably listening to this podcast, it all seems very complex, very convoluted, very unreal. And what do you see is really going on and what really will actually happen, let's say in the next year or 2 years?
Yeah. I'd say first and foremost, not all laws are good laws and not all policy is a good thing, right? And particularly when you look at the rash of transparency and reporting bills, what we haven't seen is any kind of real impact in terms of more humane conditions for workers and even a dent when it comes to emissions and the climate crisis. So the idea, much like multi-stakeholder initiatives of laws that are focused on reporting, I'm very skeptical of. For us, it's really important that any laws, any bills are really centering the communities that they profess to serve and that worker partners have a seat at the table. I will say I'm hopeful because 30 years of the industry saying it's all voluntary, we're going to do this, keep growing and keeping our businesses and at the same time take care of people and the planet, we haven't seen progress. And the fact that lawmakers in Europe, in the UK, in the US are finally paying attention, I think it's hopeful. And I'd say of all the things that I'm most hopeful about, a few things, two examples come to mind. One is closing the de minimis loophole right here at home. I think in the US, there's bipartisan support for that. Look, if we're saying Shein workers are producing something like 35,000 to 100,000 items daily, today they're 1/5 of the global fast fashion market. And then they're able to, through a loophole of $800 shipments, not pay custom tax. That's problematic. And that's where we have that sort of down market, ultra fast fashion pushing on wages, as we were talking about, and why we see conditions across the fashion supply chain to be so problematic. So I think closing the de minimis loophole, I'm excited about that. I think what we did in California with upchain liability, we should really be exploring that in other places, states, as well as, we have a sister bill, the Fabric Act. We really shouldn't in 2024 be paying workers piece rate and not holding brands jointly accountable for wages. So that's something I'm really excited about. And then, on the climate crisis, there are important things brewing from a extended product responsibility standpoint. We're just making too much, as you know, Andrew. The data says 103 billion units of clothes today, projected to become 291 billion by 2032. And so if we are really serious about fashion's focus on fossil fuel and growing this rapidly, we're going to need thoughtful EPR bills, but really that are justice focused, to make sure that the industry is paying for its environmental footprint.
Doesn't pay for anything. I mean, basically, if you go to a producing country, I spoke at a conference in Bangladesh, they have literally no water.
Yeah.
There was, I won't say the brand, but there was a couple of brands on the panel with me. And I said to the audience, you realize these people are going to come and take all your water for their jeans. And when you run out, they're going to go somewhere else.
Right. And think about the
Charge them
humane
for
impact of
replenishment.
that. Look, growing up in Pakistan, I'm very well familiar with water shortages. And so there is that sort of colonial aspect to this then, right? You're diverting water supply for jeans that what an American consumer is going to wear a few times and throw away. And meanwhile, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis can't access clean water. That's messed up.
It's so messed up. And everyone knows it. It's on the table. It's very clear.
Yeah.
Anyway, question.
Hmm.
There are some companies where the executives are paid according to their environmental success. Most companies not. Do you think that if we're going to have any progress, that there should be a link between salary and actually achievements on the environmental front?
It's such an interesting question, Andrew, because I often think depending on where the sustainability or CSR folks report into tells you a lot about what the company thinks about these issues. So if they're reporting into marketing or comms, it's just a comm strategy. They're not serious about it. If it's reporting into legal, really this is about legal compliance, worried about getting sued. But this idea of, how do we really tie it to the core business model is a really important one. And I'd say executive bonuses, the way and salaries tie it not just to environmental sustainability, but how about human rights as well?
Totally. I'm a big believer in that. And I think that has to be like one of the things I think is interesting is how do we decide, you said, where are your values? Okay. So who has our values? I think it's more difficult to find those people than it is to find those that don't have our values.
100%. And look, if you're saying I as the CEO of a publicly traded company, have quarter over quarter pressure to keep growing, to keep delivering on my earning targets, and then somehow I'm also to pay a living wage and to reduce my reliance on fossil fuel. You're not going to do that without the right performance structures and incentives. So I think, yeah, if companies really want to wear their values, build in the accountability mechanisms.
But
Otherwise, it's just marketing, really.
consumers know who doesn't do that. And you mentioned shame earlier. One of the things that is fascinating is, yes, shame is not helpful.
Mhm.
On the other hand, Greenpeace has had a lot of success shaming people. They
Yes.
actually are the most successful organization in creating change that I know of.
Yes. Don't get me wrong. You know, campaigns, and we have had some successful campaigns under our belt, can be massively important in having those wins. And Greenpeace, you're absolutely right, particularly when it comes to restricted substances, their detox fashion campaign was so important for the movement. But when we are talking about some of the structural issues of the fact that we are overproducing and that we're paying people too little and not making any dent when it comes to living wages and the hours people have to work to not even put food on the table, we're not going to get to those structural issues a campaign at a time. I think campaigns are good for short term wins to make workers whole when egregious, terrible things happen. In our world, the question is often, it sounds very ghoulish, like how many people have to die for the industry to pay attention? But
Oh,
then what you see is they revert back to the bad behavior the minute the headlines go away. And the truth is, now that we're competing in a digitally connected, constantly competing for eyeballs with a TikTok or an Instagram, it's very difficult to have that scandal stay in the headlines for that long, which is why I welcome some of the regulation from a structural standpoint, because how many campaigns in our lifetime are we going to win? It's important, but I think we have to also think about systematically change the contracts, regulate this industry.
that takes me back to you talk about campaigns. Can you talk about your PayUp campaign?
Absolutely. We are going to be a decade old
Should
this
be really
year at
proud of it.
Remake. And I would say, in all my years of doing this work, probably I am proudest of the Pay Up campaign. It truly is an example of when thoughtful people and coalition partners come together, the power of what we can do. So sort of take you back. March 2020, whole world shut down. All of us suddenly were told, it's a grinding halt, and no one was buying anything. Suddenly, everyone was maybe making bread and cooking, and that's what our Instagram post showed. And US apparel consumption dropped within that very first month by 89%. And what fashion brands across the board did was cancel orders using the force majeure clause, which is perfectly legal. But what that meant is that workers around the world were not going to get paid. And I think what's important here to note is that everyone did it, right? The fashion giants like Zara and CNA and H&M, but also Primark and Gap and Ross and JC Penney. And, I think there was an early,
And Amazon, all of them.
all of them, everyone did it. I think the Daily Star, Bangladesh newspaper, noted right at the start that 127 major apparel brands and 1,931 buyers canceled orders. And what we know is that if orders are canceled and vaccines are not here yet, workers around the world were not going to get paid. These are not people with savings so much to fall back on. And this is where our beautiful coalition was formed. We had Dr. Anner from Penn State University, who's one of the world's top experts on sweatshops and labor rights, who surveyed and was able to put in the public domain, along with Worker Rights Consortium, who was canceling orders and who wasn't. I didn't sleep for months during that time period, but we welcomed labor groups, but also manufacturers, campaigners into closed door meetings. And the Pay Up campaign was born. We were sharing information. We had labor behind the label, clean clothes campaign, Extinction Rebellion, and all said and done, the Pay Up campaign was able to get more than 20 brands to reverse that decision of canceling orders. Over $20 billion of contracts were reinstated, which meant millions of people at the height of the pandemic were paid. And that really is the power of what consumer citizens locking arms with labor can look like, and how coalitions can be really powerful.
It's amazing. It's an amazing story. You should be.
I mean, and it's I think Dr. Anner has published an academic study on this as well. And again, this is where I think thoughtful academia, labor partners, all of us locking arms, and really our young people, at a time when we couldn't be out on the streets protesting, Instagram became so important, social media, there was so many influencers, young people taking in some ways, some brands later behind the scenes told me it's such a specific industry thing. How did this become viral in public consciousness? That, there were people holding up signs saying, pay up, pay up, pay up. And it became untenable for brands to take that position. And that's the kind of reputation damage that renders results.
So I have two last questions for you.
Yes.
The first, which is kind of out there, but somebody called me about a month ago, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 months ago, and said that they heard rumors that there are all sorts of issues on social compliance with farming in Pakistan. And I started to laugh, and I said, "Are you sure there's none in Louisiana?" I mean, are you really? I'm sorry, I don't know the case that you're talking about, but as far as I know, there is no social compliance whatsoever for the farming industry. And there's a way to go around and sort and say Pakistan is this, India is this, and Tanzania is this, and Texas is this, and Louisiana is this. It's just human beings.
Yeah.
So what should there be put in place, or should there anything be put in place? And it should just be out in the public domain that farming is farming.
The question you pose is so important because, look, we have industry after industry, whether it's sugar, cotton, clothing, time and time again, scandal after scandal to say social compliance doesn't work. And that you said this at the start of the conversation, that this is really about industry having an insurance policy by paying, whether it's their own folks or an external auditor, to make sure everything is okay. But we're not getting to the root cause of, the way that product is placed, the prices that are paid, how product is shipped out. Often this is through networks of consultants who then can ship out to others who may not have the local context. And so it really is just window dressing on a much deeper problem, where I think, well, what works in really bubbling up issues in a workplace, whether farm or factory? It's unions, it's organized labor, it's having that real infrastructure, and then the direct engagement with the buyer on what those issues are. The only time I would say any kind of social compliance would work is put it in the public domain and tie it not just to the farm or the factory, but tie it to the actual buyers. And then you'll start to see patterns. If you put in the public domain and suddenly see, how is it that regardless of what commodity is being bought, there's a lot of child labor in Walmart farms and factories? Well, maybe that says more about Walmart than it does the farm and factory. And so I think any kind of compliance, we should tie it to the buyers. Otherwise, we're going to get nowhere.
Okay. Then my last question.
Yes.
I hear friends of mine in the industry, and a lot of people talk about it, that there's less and less young people going in our industry. How do we stop that?
Well, it goes back to the conversation we were having around where are your values. I can't tell you how many young people I mentor, starry-eyed, that want to make a difference and are abjectly disillusioned once they enter the industry. Thoughtful creative designers, when it's like, well, our industry doesn't make beautiful creative things anymore. It's a volume game. So I think it's fundamentally about how what we make has changed and what we value as well. And so perhaps that's an incentive for executives or fashion brands that are listening to say, if you want to recruit and retain top talent, then what is your value system when it comes to how product is made? I know also from our next gen community at Remake that climate is really top of mind for this generation. And so, if as an industry we continue to just focus on polyester growth as the answer, I think that's also a reason why a lot of young people think, what are we talking about when fires and floods and climate events have become our reality, that we're making clothes in this way and also throwing them away so fast? So I think it goes back to the structural issues. We're not going to market our way into getting young people to be excited about working for the fashion industry. We have to tackle the things we've been talking about.
Thank you. Thank you, Ayesha. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and I hope our listeners love listening to you as much as I do.
Thank you so much. If anyone wants to follow along, our Instagram is Remake Our World, and I hope that people enjoyed the conversation. And I, as always, appreciate you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.